Glaciers melting rapidly. Scientists seek new data on rising seas. Scientists long believed that the collapse of the gigantic ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica would take thousands of years, with sea level possibly rising as little as 7 inches in this century, about the same amount as in the 20th century. But now they say that might not be true. Researchers have recently been startled to see big changes unfold in both Greenland and Antarctica. As a result of recent calculations that take the changes into account, many scientists now say that sea level is likely to rise perhaps 3 feet by 2100, an increase that, should it come to pass, would pose a threat to coastal regions the world over. And that could be a conservative estimate. The calculations also suggest that the rise could conceivably exceed 6 feet or more, which would put thousands of square miles of the American coastline underwater and would probably displace tens of millions of people in Asia. The scientists say that a rise of even 3 feet would flood low-lying lands in many countries, rendering many areas uninhabitable. It would cause coastal flooding of the sort that now happens once or twice a century to occur every few years. It would cause much faster erosion of beaches, barrier islands, and marshes. It would contaminate fresh water supplies with salt. In the United States, parts of the East Coast and Gulf Coast would be hit hard. In New York, coastal flooding could become routine, with large parts of Queens and Brooklyn especially vulnerable. Approximately 15% of the urbanized land in the Miami region could be also flooded. The ocean could encroach more than a mile inland in parts of North Carolina. Abroad, some of the world's great cities, London, Cairo, Bangkok, Venice, and Shanghai among them, would be critically endangered by a 3-foot rise in the sea. And climate scientists readily admit that the 3-foot estimate could be wrong. Their understanding of the changes going on in the world's land ice is still primitive, but they say it could just as easily be an underestimate as an overestimate. One of the deans of American Coastal Studies of Duke University is advising coastal communities to plan for a rise of at least 5 feet by 2100, if not more. I think we need immediately to begin thinking about our coastal cities. How are we going to protect them? Said John A. Church, an Australian scientist who is a leading expert on sea level. We can't afford to protect everything. We will have to abandon some areas. Sea level rise has been a particularly contentious element in the debate over global warming. One published estimate suggested the threat was so dire that sea level could rise as much as 15 feet in this century. Some of the recent work that produced the 3-foot projection was carried out specifically to counter more extreme calculations. Global warming skeptics, on the other hand, contend that any changes occurring in the ice sheets are probably due to natural climate variability, not to greenhouse gases released by humans. Although approximately 98% of scientists worldwide say that global warming is real. And such doubts have been a major factor in the American political debate over global warming, stalling efforts by Democrats in the Obama administration to pass legislation that would curb emissions of heat-trapping gases. Similar legislative efforts are likely to receive even less support in the new Congress, with many newly elected legislators openly skeptical about climate change. Again, a large majority of climate scientists argue that heat-trapping gases are almost certainly playing a role in what is happening to the world's land ice. They add that the lack of policies to limit emissions is raising the risk that the ice will go into an irreversible decline before this century is out, a development that would eventually make a 3-foot rise in the sea look trivial. In other words, it could easily rise a lot more than that, and that would be extremely bad or worrisome. And yet, the rise of the sea could turn out to be the single most serious effect, while the United States is among the countries at greatest risk. Neither it nor any other wealthy country has made tracking and understanding the changes in the ice a strategic national priority. So the consequence is that researchers lack elementary information. They have been unable even to measure the water temperature near some of the most important ice on the planet, much less to figure out if that water is warming over time. Vital satellites have not been replaced in a timely way, so that American scientists are losing some of their capability to watch the ice from space. The missing information makes it impossible for scientists to be sure how serious the situation is. As a scientist, you have to stick to what you know and what the evidence suggests, said one researcher, Gordon Hamilton. And what we've seen in Greenland in the last 5 years is alarming. We see these ice sheets changing literally overnight. Within the past decade, the flow rate of many of Greenland's biggest glaciers has doubled or tripled. 2 seismologists of Columbia University discovered a few years ago that unusual earthquakes were coming from the Greenland glaciers as they dumped the extra ice into the sea. It's remarkable that an iceberg can do this, but when that loss of ice occurs, it does generate a signal that sets up a vibration that you can record all across the globe. Analyzing past records, they discovered that these quakes had increased several-fold from the level of the early 1990s, a sign of how fast the ice is changing. Satellite and other measurements suggest that through the 1990s, Greenland was gaining about as much ice through snowfall as it lost to the sea every year. But since then, the warmer water has invaded, and air temperatures in Greenland have increased markedly. The overall loss of ice seems to be accelerating, an ominous sign given that the island contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by more than 20 feet. Many scientists also say that the recent changes in Greenland appear more pervasive than those of the early 20th century, and that they are occurring at the same time that air and ocean temperatures are warming, and ice melt is accelerating rapidly throughout much of the world. So, what does that tell you? An ocean in flux. The strongest reason to think that the level of the sea could undergo big changes in the future is that it has done so in the past. With the waxing and waning of ice ages, driven by wobbles in the Earth's orbit, sea level has varied by hundreds of feet, with shorelines moving many miles in either direction. We're used to the shoreline being fixed, and it's not. But at all times in the past, when the shoreline migrated, humans either had not evolved yet, or consisted of primitive bands of hunter-gatherers who could easily or readily move. By the middle of this century, a projected 9 billion people will inhabit the planet, with many millions of them living within a few feet of sea level. To a majority of climate scientists, the question is not whether the Earth's land ice will melt in response to the greenhouse gases those people are generating, but whether it will happen too fast for society to adjust. And that is a very good question. Recent research suggests that the volume of the ocean may have been stable for thousands of years as human civilization has developed, but it began to rise in the 19th century, around the same time that advanced countries began to burn large amounts of coal and oil. The sea has risen approximately 8 inches since then on average. That sounds small, but on a gently sloping shoreline, such an increase is enough to cause substantial erosion unless people intervene. Governments have spent billions of dollars in recent decades pumping sand onto disappearing beaches and trying to stave off the loss of coastal wetlands. Scientists have been struggling for years to figure out if a similar pace of sea level rise is likely to continue in this century, or whether it will accelerate. In its last big report, in 2007, the United Nations group that assesses climate science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that sea level would rise at least 7 more inches and might rise as much as 2 feet. But the group warned that these estimates did not fully incorporate ice dynamics, the possibility that the world's big ice sheets, as well as its thousands of smaller glaciers and ice caps, would start spitting ice into the sea or the ocean at a much faster rate than it could melt on land. Scientific understanding of this prospect was so poor, the climate panel said, that no meaningful upper limit could be put on the potential rise of sea level. That report prompted fresh attempts by scientists to calculate the effect of ice dynamics, leading to the recent revised projections of sea level rise. Satellite evidence suggests that the rise of the sea accelerated late in the 20th century, so that the level is now increasing a little over an inch per decade, on average, about a foot per century. Increased melting of land ice appears to be a major factor. Another is that most of the extra heat being trapped by human greenhouse emissions is going not to warm the atmosphere, but to warm the ocean, and as it warms, the water expands. So, with the study of the world's land ice still in its early stages, scientists have lately been trying crude methods to figure out exactly how much the pace might accelerate in coming decades. But again, it is accelerating. It's increasing in speed, faster and faster. And these are all more signs of the end times, transition days, which is a continuing daily process, because it's about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations. Revelation chapter 15. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. 2. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. 3. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. 4. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. 5. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. 6. And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. 7. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. 8. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no human was able to enter into the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. And yes, there are many kinds of signs happening daily all around the world.